1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Did you learn that when you were younger, perhaps? We were taught about Christopher Columbus and all the great white European explorers of the 15th and 16th centuries when I was younger. These people who discovered places on the globe that were heretofore unknown. Well, they certainly had been known. They just hadn't been known by white Europeans until that time. And this was taught to us in a way that was, we were to be proud of this. And isn't it wonderful? Because that's how we got here. And that was the beginning of things, but it certainly wasn't the beginning of things. And I want to flip the narrative for you and talk to you today about the dangers of that narrative and resting on it, and how we can do better, and how as a people of faith, we are called to do better and to make changes. And I want to talk to you about a few books. Some books that have been very influential for me, and some other stuff in leading up to this service, and I think that you might find beneficial too. The first is An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. And this was several years ago a UUA common read. So you might find this book very interesting, and it was very helpful for me. And another book that I think is critical for us is not so much a book, but a collection of books. And I'm going to tell you this is why I think that it's important, regardless of your theology, to understand this text. And that book or collection of books is the Bible. The Bible is important because so much of what was done in the name of conquest was done in the name of religion, rightly or wrongly, and in the name of through misinterpretation of scripture. And so it is incumbent upon us to understand what the scripture says so that we can be informed. And a book that I found particularly useful in preparing for this service and in understanding the complexities of what was going on in the early days, and helping me better understand the Indigenous Peoples History book even, is a book called Joshua in 3D by L. Daniel Hawk. Now, this is a little more academic and digging into the book of Joshua, but it's a really good book about understanding manifest destiny as it ties into the book of Joshua. And then there is a piece that's been circulating on social media recently about The Invisible Elephant by Julie Cordero Lamb. And if you Google Julie Cordero Lamb and Invisible Elephant, you will find that piece. Looks like it was actually a small sermon given or a homily given in a church in 2020, but that's an excellent piece and I found useful for this service. So when I'm saying that a lot of things that we're talking about today have to do with religion, specifically Christianity, what am I talking about? I'm talking about the doctrine of discovery. Well, what's the doctrine of discovery? This is simply a doctrine that was put out around the time of Columbus, stating that any European Christians, any nation that discovered someplace that might inconveniently have been inhabited by people, but they weren't Christian, if it was inhabited by heathens, or not my words, there were savages, as they would say, or but non-Christians, it could be claimed by that nation in the name of God, because of course they would have a duty to convert people to Christianity. And conveniently take over the land and destroy the land, pulling out all the resources in the name of whatever crown they served. Manifest destiny, as it was interpreted in the United States, is a direct descendant of the doctrine of discovery. God created the world belongs to God. The Pope is the messenger of God. Therefore, how can what we're doing be wrong? We're claiming this in the name of God, as if only Christians, only the Pope has anything to say about God. No other religions could possibly be right. Well, that's certainly very convenient when all the lands that you're going to have riches that you only dream about. Gold, silver, gemstones, other raw materials that you need for shipbuilding and other manufacturing and all the things that you want to build with, right? So the doctrine of discovery was the rule of law and was the guiding force. Now, this didn't seem to get in the way too much even after non-white people converted to Christianity. In fact, at one point, the church even ruled that some folks were not fully human. And that's for another time. Now, the piece that I referred to by Julie Cordero Lamb, The Invisible Elephant, she's talking about a symposium that she went to when she was a postdoctoral student. On religions, diasporic religions. And people were talking about Judaism in the diaspora and other religions in diaspora, and it was all working out very well. And she decided that nobody was talking about something that she felt was really important. She is from a First Nation, and she's from an Indigenous nation. And she wanted to talk about the Christian diaspora, the effect of the diasporic religion of Christianity in North America, and the effect it was having on Indigenous cultures. And when she brought this up, there was dead silence in the room. And people started to backpedal. Because you see, almost everybody else in the room was white. And many of them considered themselves to be liberals and forward thinkers. But they thought of themselves as the default. And they thought of Christianity as the default. And somebody even said that, but that's not a diasporic religion. It's American. She pointed out that the indigenous faiths were what was local and American. And another speaker tried to argue that those faiths weren't current. And yet she could point to people who were currently practicing those indigenous faiths. What happens because of this doctrine of discovery, because historically we have told ourselves that we are right and we are the ones descended from directly from God, this is what God told us, is we start to believe that we are default and everyone else and everything else is other. And it was really difficult for people to understand that Christianity in America could be part of a diaspora, part of something that has been spread out. I think the article is worth a read. The point I want to make from that is, yeah, we have to get over ourselves a bit, but we can't do that until we stop thinking of ourselves as default and automatically correct. We who are in the dominant culture, we have to sometimes step out of our own space and ask ourselves, am I centering myself? What about the people around me? What other questions should I be asking? Now, I went to 3 high schools, but my last high school and my favorite one was Nyack High School in Nyack, New York. It's named for the Nyack Indians, who incidentally didn't live in the Nyack area, but it's named for the Nyack Indians. And you will be shocked to know that our mascot was an Indian. But no one had ever done any research to discover who the Nyack Indians were. We weren't taught anything about the Nyack Indians specifically, or any of the local indigenous people in my high school. Our, I'm ashamed to say, Indianettes wore big headdresses, more appropriate for Plains Indians, and certainly not seen on young girls who were doing dance routines in front of the football team. And other teams, when they played us, would say things like, "Scalp the Indians." It was an entirely inappropriate mascot. In the last few years in my high school, there has been mounting pressure to change the mascot. And there has been a big hue and cry from my former classmates, from my former white classmates, about how we can't do that. I found it interesting that the objection is coming solely from white classmates. My school was very mixed. And the objection is not coming from people of color. People who have been oppressed understand oppression. When we see ourselves as default, we start to see others as less than. Halloween is approaching. When I was a child, it was perfectly acceptable to dress up as an Indian. And I'm sad to see that you can still get costumes like that. We cannot simply put on the costume of another culture. That is a violence. But beloveds, we have done so much more than that. We have done so much more than that. What has enabled us to do that? Well, we came in and we took land. We learned that the first people who came here were settlers. They were not settlers, they were colonizers, they were oppressors. The first people that the European colonizers tried to enslave were the indigenous people here. That didn't work so well. They were well connected. They had cities and trade routes and families, and it didn't work. And so that's when they turned to enslaving Africans, whom they brought here, disconnected from family and villages. We brought disease. What we weren't taught in school about Columbus was that he brought disease with him. If you've ever been to Puerto Rico, or if you come from Puerto Rico, you might know that there are almost no descendants left of the original inhabitants of Puerto Rico, because they were almost all killed off from the diseases brought by the original Europeans. In fact, it was the policy, the official policy of the US government to kill indigenous people, to round up and kill indigenous people, and there were bounties for that. And that is where the term redskin, a word I don't even like to say, comes from. Because there were bounties, but bringing back whole bodies was inconvenient. Scalping comes not from the indigenous people, they didn't invent it, but from the Europeans who brought scalps in to show how many people, how many indigenous people they had killed. And the blood is where the term redskin came from. This became so ingrained in our military culture that we still use terms from that today. When the military, when the army specifically, but when the military talks about being in country, that is when they're deployed to a place, when they're in the place where the fighting, where the action is happening, that isn't referring to inside versus outside. That is short for Indian country. We are still using those terms today. It is ingrained in our military culture. This is because we were taught to see people as less than, as other. How does this fit in to the Bible? I said this was tied into the Bible. Well, this is part of what's called the Deuteronomistic history. And particularly in the book of Joshua, we see where God is helping the Israelites enter and recapture the land of Canaan. But what we have to understand about this is this was a book written for a people in exile, for a people who were oppressed at the time the book was written, who were in exile, and it was helping them. It was like a cheerleading book in some ways. It was helping them to understand and recapture their own identity. It is not a history. It is not explaining things as they happened. So people, leaders glommed onto this, took this and said, see, we're just like Joshua. See, we're taking control. This is from the Bible. We're conquering. It's right. But what they failed to recognize, friends, was that in Joshua, God's mercy leads. And when people stop doing the killing and the conquering, that's when things always work out better for them and for everyone else. The times that the book was written in are not our time. And the book was not written for the oppressors. It was not written for the people in power. We have to read it from the margins. So here we are today in the 21st century, living with the legacy of the doctrine of discovery, living with the legacy of the Trail of Tears, living with the legacy of having killed off so many people, of having ripped children away from their parents, sent them to boarding schools. And by the way, our own Unitarian and Universalist ancestors ran some of those schools. Not letting them speak their own languages. Forcing people onto reservations. And what do we do now? Well, land acknowledgements are a tiny first step. That's one thing. One thing you can do wherever you are in the United States and possibly Canada, is to text this number that Allison has put in the chat. The phone number is 855-917-5263. And if you put in a place, just the town name and the state, it will tell you whose land you are on. And you can also use the website land.codeforanchorage, land.codeforanchorage.org. And that's also in the chat. You can do the same thing there. But land acknowledgement, that's nothing if we don't go beyond that. If that's all we do, then it's only performative. What else can we do? Well, reparations is a thing. Reparations is really important. And it's expensive. Recently in, I think, Los Angeles or around Los Angeles, the city decided that they really had to give back some land, some beachfront property to an African-American family from whom the land was wrongly stolen, effectively. That property is worth millions. but it was the right thing to do. Yes, it definitely cost the city money, and it was the right thing to do. If we are to mend what we have broken and build the beloved community, we must start to mend what we have broken with the indigenous people whose lands we have occupied. We can't fix everything, but we can stop running pipelines through reservation. When people ask us for help, we can say, what do you need from me? That's not the same as going to people and saying, I know what you need. That's saying, what do you need from me? How can I leverage my privilege to help you? And we can advocate for reparations. We can decenter ourselves and our own privilege when it is appropriate to do so. There are times when we might not have privilege. But when we are the privileged party in the room, we might need to step aside and recognize it's not about me. We can leverage our privilege when we see things that are wrong. Do you see an Indian costume in a store? Speak to the manager. That's easy. What are some of the things that you can do? We can stop tokenizing and othering. When someone shares things with you and says, this is Native American, ask yourself, is it? And when you say Native American, recognize there are many nations. A dream catcher is Hopi. It's not generically Native American. And it's a very specific thing. It's meant to go over a bed. It's not meant to be earrings or a decoration over your sofa. If you want a dream catcher, make sure you're getting it from a Hopi artisan. Support the people who need our support. Don't turn them into costumes. Let's not put on someone else's culture as an affect. I have been guilty of this myself. I certainly have. But when I knew better, I did better. And I know you, beloveds, and I know you will too. I want to talk to you about a hymn we'll be singing a little later. It's called We'll Build a Land. Now this is based on some biblical texts, and it's a lovely hymn. But it has some lines in it about building up ancient cities and devastations of old and building up the ruins. And I want us to think about what it sounds like to those of us who are coming from a privileged place, and what it might sound like to someone who is in a conquered place. Who did the devastating of the ancient cities here? Beloveds, for those of us who come from European ancestry, it was us. It was us. We can sing this hymn, but we must sing it with care and understanding that we are not the great saviors coming in to fix what the other people couldn't do. Let us sing it to remind ourselves that we are here to repair what we ourselves had a hand in breaking. Let us do the work of repairing ourselves. And in that way, we will repair the whole world. Beloveds, we can build the beloved community together. I know we can do this. We must see each other for who we truly are. None of you are a costume to me. Namaste.